Today, in the next couple of sessions, we're going to be talking about the role of Congress. And before we start, just want to share with you, in terms of where we are in the course. The first part of the course really dealt with foundations and the Constitution. So we talked about the beginnings about democracy, of course, and the Constitution, and the relationship between the federal government and the states, the topic of federalism. So that covered the first unit of material. The second unit of material was looking more specifically at political behavior. So therefore, we were talking about things like parties, interest groups, campaigns, elections, public opinion and voting, those kinds of topics. Now we're moving into essentially the third unit of material, where we're going to be talking about institutions and the policies that emanate from those institutions. So we're going to be talking about Congress, the presidency, bureaucracy, and then we're going to talk about public policy, foreign policy and domestic policy, and policies that flow as an outcome of those processes that take place in those institutions. Then the final section of the course is going to be dealing more specifically with the Supreme Court and some discussion about civil liberties and civil rights. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about Congress, and we're moving into Congress, and that's where we are. And speaking of Congress, then, when people think about Congress today, they often have negative impressions. You hear, for example, about the influence of interest groups and PACs pumping all this money into congressional campaigns. You may see news stories about how powerful interest groups are hosting big parties for members of Congress, or how these interest groups may be taking congressional staffs on vacations to luxury resorts or something like that. We often hear about how politicians, and particularly members of Congress, are so, quote, out of touch with the people. And if you look at opinion polls, they consistently show that a majority of the American people think that members of Congress, and the Congress as an institution, is corrupt. And interestingly, while we don't like Congress as a whole, we keep on sending the same representative back to Washington. It's almost as if, even though we don't like Congress as an institution, we love our representative or our senator if love is meant by re-electing that individual over and over again. So we blame Congress for all the problems that we have in our nation, yet we don't blame our own individual member of Congress. We may hear our senator or representative tell us that he or she is always trying to fight for us, that they're trying to fight, quote, the special interest, and trying to fight the career politicians. They say, if you elect me to Congress, I'm going to fight the career politicians. And yet, interestingly, some of the same people who say they're going to fight the career politicians are, interestingly themselves, career politicians. If you look at their background of some of the candidates who are running for members of Congress, they are often formerly state representatives or state senators, governors, and so they do have quite a long legacy of a political background. Well, today we're going to take an in-depth look at Congress and see what Congress is really all about. And hopefully we may learn a few things that may challenge some of our stereotypes we may have about Congress. So we'll start off first of all talking about, again, how I like to compare our system to other systems. So we'll go back and look at Congress and I want to ask you, the question is, how does Congress differ from other legislatures, other parliamentary democracies? And really, there are a couple of different ways in which you'll see a difference between the way our Congress is structured and the way legislatures and European parliamentary democracies are structured. And the first point of comparison is, probably the best point of comparison at this point, is the selection of the chief executive. In Western Europe, many of these parliamentary democracies, the prime minister is chosen by the Parliament and not the people. All right? And their prime minister is their chief executive, like our chief executive is the president. So, because the prime minister is chosen by the Parliament, that goes back to what we were talking about back in the discussion of the Constitution, where you have the executive branch is wedded to the legislative branch. And as part of this, if the prime minister is chosen by the Parliament, one thing you can know for sure is that the prime minister will always be a member of the same party as the majority party is in Parliament. Okay, that will always be the case. A party controlling Parliament, the majority party will always, the prime minister will come from that party. But anyway, so one important difference of comparison is how we go about selecting our chief executive. Of course, here in the United States, we select our chief executive by the people. And what that also means in terms of comparison is that oftentimes our president will be a member of one party, and the Congress can often be controlled by the other party. All right, and so you have, and that has a lot of implications in terms of how things get done. So we don't have our branches wedded together, of course, and while many European parliaments do have their branches wedded together in terms of how they select their chief executive. Now, a second important comparison between our system and their system is the level of control by the party leadership. Parliaments tend to be made up of people who are loyal to the party leadership, okay? And thus, as a member of Parliament, you're going to base your votes on what top party leaders want you to do. You're much more beholden to the party leadership, and that goes part to the fact that they have a multi-party system and a strong party system operating over there, as we've talked about before in the past. So over there, if a party leadership supports a particular position, you are strongly expected to vote the party line. It's a much more monolithic group in that regard. And by contrast, over here in America, members of Congress tend to think of themselves as independent representatives of the people. They are less obliged to follow the party leadership. Now, obviously, they will follow the party leadership and party positions, but they are not as beholden to the party leadership as members of Parliament are. And here, by contrast, in America, members of Congress are more obliged to follow the wishes of the voter, particularly those in the House of Representatives. And so while members of Congress may support their party position on many issues, there are some cases here where they will not. They'll buck the party leadership and vote for the constituents. And a good example, or vote along the lines of what the constituents want them to do. And a good example of that historically has been Southern Democrats, conservative Southern Democrats in Congress over our history. Many times the Democratic Party leadership may want, let's say if you're dealing with an issue like Medicaid funding of abortions, the Democratic Party position may be that they would want to have all the members of the Democratic Party voting for this particular bill, but the constituents, the Southern conservative Democrats in Congress, may very well feel like that would alienate their constituents, them from their constituents, and upset their constituency. So they'll tend to vote they would vote against that bill and vote more along the wishes of their constituency. Okay, so you might even say that the constituent plays a more important role in influencing the way a member of Congress votes, while the party leadership plays a more important role in determining their votes in Parliament. Now, of course, if we go back to the early years of Congress, when our Congress was first formed, when it was first created under our Constitution, I want to remind you of a couple things. There were two basic concerns that were expressed by the founders that influenced the structure of Congress. All right, the first concern was this idea of the concentration of power. You know, we've talked about that before. We were concerned about Congress being about power being too concentrated in one area. So going back to the Federalist Papers and the discussion by Madison and others, we formed a Congress instead of a Parliament, and we basically separated the executive from the legislative branch. So we had that separation of powers operating. And the second concern, of course, was the fact that the states wanted to make sure that their interests were protected. And so the way they did that was that we created a bicameral legislature with the House of Representatives and the Senate. And the idea is that the House of Representatives might represent more the larger states. The larger states might have a greater influence, those had more population. But while in the Senate, since there were two senators from each state, the smaller states would not feel like they were being trampled upon in the Senate, so they have more of an equal voice in the Senate. And of course, that was part of the Great Compromise, the Connecticut Plan. Now, some more background information. If you wanted to find out exactly what powers that Congress had, where do you go back and look? You go look in the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8. You remember the thing about delegated powers. Examples of specific powers, of course, including the ability to collect taxes, to declare war, to coin money, to raise and support an army. And also don't forget about implied powers, which expanded the scope of Congress over time, and that was to make all laws that are necessary and proper for carrying out its enumerated powers. Today, in terms of numbers, there are 435 House members, of course, and 100 senators. Missouri has 9 representatives, 9 congressional districts that belong to the House of Representatives, 9 members, and then, of course, 2 senators. Every 10 years, the House of Representatives reapportions its seats among the states based on changes to the populations from state to state. That 435 number does not change. It will always be 435 voting members of Congress. But the proportion of the allocation of the districts from one state to the next depend upon changes based upon the census that's taken every 10 years. And in recent decades, what have we seen? Well, many of the northeastern states have been losing seats in the House, while many of the southern and southwestern states have been gaining some seats. A couple more issues that we'll talk about. How many years does a representative serve in Congress? And the House of Representatives, 2 years, of course, and a senator serves 6 years. Now, I point this out because I want you to understand what this might imply for how they make decisions. If you think about this, if you're only serving 2 years in the House of Representatives, the minute you get elected, you've got 2 years to prove yourself. In a lot of ways, once you move to Washington and set up your staff, you've got to hit the ground running, not only making good decisions and representing your constituents, but also campaigning for the next re-election 2 years away. That 2 years will go by very, very quickly. In a lot of ways, House of Representatives is known as the constant campaign. And so they're always campaigning and raising money. They're very much concerned about pleasing their constituents and trying to get in front of the constituents and make sure that they're happy, and so they'll get reelected. Now, the point here is that you've got that for 2 years. Now, senators have the luxury of serving for 6 years, and how might that imply how they make decisions? Well, think about this. If you are a representative, then you really are very much beholden to your constituents. If you're a senator, you're also beholden to your constituents, but you're not quite as bound by your constituents because, for one thing, they cover a much wider area in the entire state as opposed to a particular legislative district. So senators basically have more this sense of a broader conception of the public interest, and that actually gets into what I want to share with you about the different roles that members of Congress have. There are 2 basic roles. There's this idea of a trustee role and a delegate role, all right? Members of the House of Representatives embody more of this delegate role. And the delegate role is, tell me how you want me to vote. Tell me what you want, I'm going to do it for you. I am your delegate, I will vote the way that you want me to vote. The trustee role is the idea, and this is the one that's embodied more by senators, more predominant in the Senate. And the trustee role is, you have entrusted to me the responsibility to make decisions on your behalf for the next 6 years. So because of that, my decisions, I'm not going to be as worried on the day-to-day decisions and votes that I'm casting, how I'm pleasing you. I'm going to be able to take a little bit of a broader conception of the public interest. And so that's the idea of a trustee role versus a delegate role. The senators embody more of that trustee role. The House of Representatives, members of the House, embody more of that delegate role. And let me show you how that plays out just briefly here. Let's just say, for example, now this actually, if you remember back in 1991, during the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a lot of discussion about, well, does the United States really need to have all these military bases all across the United States and all around the world? There was talk of this idea of a peace dividend, that maybe we could cut back taxes and really spend a lot less on defense than we had been up to that point. As you may know, during the Reagan administration from 1980 to 1988, that marked one of the biggest peacetime military buildups that the world has seen. So by the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, which essentially kind of marked the end of the Cold War, people began to say, well, do we really need to continue spending all this money for defense? Well, one of the things that was created by Congress was a base closing commission. And this commission was purposed of which was to identify military bases and installations all across, particularly the United States, to find out which ones we might be able to close because they no longer really served our long-term strategic interest. And so, as a member of the House of Representatives, you might be called to vote on this bill. Listen, and do you agree with the findings of the Base Closing Commission or not? Or as a member of the Senate, you'd also be required to vote on these recommendations. Now, let's say, for example, that here in Missouri, this Base Closing Commission decided that it was not necessarily in the long-term interest of the U.S. military to maintain Fort Leonard Wood. It was a drain on resources and so forth. So let's say that hypothetically that Fort Leonard Wood was slated for closure. Well, here's the question about this. How might a senator vote on this versus a representative? And certainly if you're a representative from that area, in the Waynesville, Missouri area, obviously you're going to vote against the recommendation from the Base Closing Commission, because to close that base would wreak economic havoc on that area, because having a military base brings a lot of economic benefits to that district. Jobs and spending, and it really does help the economy in tremendous ways. So as a member of the House of Representatives representing that area, you're much more likely to vote to maintain and keep Fort Leonard Wood open as opposed to vote for support the recommendations of the Base Closing Commission. Now, as a member of the Senate, and let's say you are a senator from Missouri, you still might very well vote against those recommendations. But on the other hand, you may realize that this Base Closing Commission has a lot of good recommendations. There are clearly a lot of bases all across the United States that no longer really need to be in operation. And so, as a person who believed in this larger conception of the public interest, what is good for America as a whole might mean closing some of these bases, and it unfortunately might mean that Fort Leonard Wood was on the chopping block. As a senator, even from Missouri, you might very well be inclined to go ahead and vote for the recommendations of the Base Closing Commission. You know that you're going to alienate that constituency in Fort Leonard Wood, but the rest of Missouri, would not have the same kind of reaction. And so the point here is that because of the number of years that you have to serve, 2 years versus 6 years, the fact that you have to listen very, very closely to your constituents in the House of Representatives, because you've got that 2-year cycle, it's going to have a bigger impact in terms of how you vote as opposed to the constituent influence and pressure if you're a member of the Senate. In the Senate, you can embody more of that trustee role and vote more often along the lines of your own conception of what the public interest is, what you think might be good for America as a whole. So again, just simply a difference in the number of years that you serve in terms of your term can have a big impact in terms of how you see your role and how you vote accordingly. Of course, by the way, as a postscript, we know that Fort Leonard Wood was not slated for closure. In fact, Fort Leonard Wood actually gained prominence and gained more military functions and missions from that exercise. In fact, that's when the decision was made to also incorporate chemical training in Fort Leonard Wood. So actually, Fort Leonard Wood benefited from the Base Closing Commission's recommendations as a postscript. Now, anyway, let's talk about some other issues too, because it seems to me that as a sure rule, we're going to talk about the power of incumbency. And as a sure rule these days in both the Senate and the House, once you're elected, your chances of staying in are actually pretty good, well up in the 90 percentile, 94 to 95 percentile. Even though the representatives have to run every 2 years, run for office every 2 years, they tend to get reelected in overwhelming numbers. Now, why is it that upwards of 90% plus of incumbents are reelected? Why is that the case? And there are several reasons why that's. In other words, we're going to be talking about the advantages of incumbency. What particular advantages do incumbents have that allow them a significant likelihood of getting reelected? Well, let's talk about some of these specific advantages of incumbency. The first advantage is the fact that members of Congress can send out free mail to their constituents on a very, very frequent basis. This is called the franking privilege. This is actually done at taxpayer expense. But essentially what this means is that I, as a member of Congress, can send out letters and newsletters back home to my constituents to tell them on a constant basis what a great job I'm doing. So maybe every 3 months or so, you may get a letter or a newsletter in the mail from your constituents giving a legislative update, talking about how well your member of Congress is doing, how well they're representing you. So that's, in a lot of ways, relatively free advertisement or substantially reduced advertisement costs for advertisement because of the franking privilege. More than that, however, let me talk about some other advantages that members of Congress have. They are allowed to make dozens of free trips back home to their district every year. All right. Now, what that basically means here is that they're always coming back home. They're not staying in Washington, D.C., but they're actually coming back home quite a bit, getting on the media when they come back home, getting involved in things like ribbon cutting ceremonies, showing up to raise money for their campaign, addressing a Sertoma club or other local civic organization. And the idea is to constantly have the opportunity to have their face put before the people. This idea of, we talked about the constant campaign of members of the House of Representatives. Let me give you another term that people refer to in Congress, in particular, again, the House. They call the House the Tuesday to Thursday Club. And the reason why they call them the Tuesday to Thursday Club is because from Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, they're in their offices, often in their offices in Washington, D.C., involved in maybe debates on the House floor. They're just doing their job, governing, passing legislation. But the reason why they call it Tuesday to Thursday is because from Friday to Monday, often they're headed back home to their district. Again, meeting with various important civic and community leaders, doing things, showing what they're doing for their district. So oftentimes, and they had the privilege of making, again, dozens of trips during a congressional term, or actually for each year, dozens of trips back home to, again, constantly have their presence known among their constituents. Not only that, but they have offices in Washington. They also have offices in their home districts, and a lot of staff people who work at these offices. Okay, and that's very important because that basically means that if a constituent has a problem, needs the help from their representative or senator, all they've got to do is go to the local home district office, and some of them have offices, like if a senator has offices in several cities. But if it's in your city, you will go to your representative or your senator, and you'll talk to a staff person about your problems. Let's say, for example, that you need to get a passport renewed, and you've got a quick deadline. One of the best and fastest ways of meeting that deadline before your plane trip, is to actually go to your district office and talk to your staff people there. But the point here is that these individuals who work for, and we'll be talking more about the role and importance of staffs down the road in in the next couple of sessions. But these people who work for the members of Congress, these staff people, play very important roles because they are the representatives' eyes and ears, and they help solve a lot of constituent problems as part of that. So if you think about this, if you have a staff of 30, 40 people spread out in your home district offices as well as your office in Washington, D.C., you've got all these people who are working for you. That can be a very important source of, or real advantage for you, because it helps to, again, you've got speech writers, you've got people who solve constituent problems, and that can be a significant advantage in, again, helping make sure that your face is put before your constituents on a constant basis. As part of that, you get a lot of free media attention. In Washington, D.C., Congress has their own television studio. And members of Congress use that all the time to do press releases to show that they're sponsoring a bill. And they have a staff that will interface with the local TV stations, and they will ship it via FedEx or through an email attachment will send to the local TV stations to be shown on the evening news. And so there might be a press release that your member of Congress is providing, showing what they are doing, or they may actually be in front of the Capitol and have a little press conference or some type of press announcement showing what they're doing in terms of sponsoring legislation. And that will get on in the evening news. So again, to remind you of all the great things that they're doing for their folks back home. Members of Congress also have this uncanny ability to get programs passed and funds spent in ways that benefit the district, okay, such as building new highways, building a new airport, building other kinds of, money that the Jordan Valley Innovation Center here at Missouri State. A lot of these kinds of programs are there because they have federal funds, and these federal funds were here or were part of this because of what our representatives and senators have done. So, for example, if I'm able to say that I'm able to maybe insert in a new highway authorization bill funds for expanding I-40 or James River Expressway to connect James River Expressway to I-44, and then take credit for that. Okay, that's a good way of bring what politicians call bringing home the bacon. I'm bringing home federal dollars to my district to benefit my constituents, and it can take all kinds of forms. Again, road transportation projects, new airports, education, money for new buildings, things like that. So these kinds of federal grants that may come back to my district, anything I can take credit for, I will take credit for if I'm a member of Congress. So anyway, that can be a very important source of power. And the last thing that I do, and I alluded to this, but the last power that an incumbent has is this ability to perform casework. And casework is basically providing specific services for members of Congress. Again, we're going to talk about this in a little bit more elaboration down the road, but basically any kind of services, whether it's to expedite passport applications, if it's to basically help somebody who has a problem with a discharge from the military, just a whole gamut of things. If I can help my constituent, I will do so. And so this is the idea of casework. If somehow maybe the Social Security Administration had, for example, determined that your grandmother was deceased and you saw her yesterday, you were over there cutting her grass or something, and you saw her yesterday, but yet she got something in the mail saying that she's been declared deceased, and so because of that, the Social Security checks have now been terminated. And then your grandmother is very, very upset about that. Well, you can actually contact the staff people in your district or in Washington to say, help, could you help me with this because the Social Security Administration messed up and my grandmother is not deceased. So they do all these kinds of services that members of Congress provide for their constituents, again, to help them continually make them known and show what a great job they're doing. So because of all these things collectively, this provides a decided advantage for incumbents. Challengers don't have all those kinds of advantages, incumbents do. And so that can help to ensure that they get reelected. Also, besides that, political action committees, as they raise money, tend to favor incumbents. The PACs would rather put up money to someone who is a known quantity or commodity rather than give money to someone who is unknown. Remember, as an incumbent, you have a voting record. And let's say, for example, that I'm voting constantly to protect American jobs. Well, in the process of having done that, there are a lot of political action committees that are out there that I may not have even heard of before, all of a sudden are going to be giving money to my re-election campaign because they like who I am, they like how I vote, they like what I've been doing to protect American jobs. And all of a sudden, in a matter of just a few months' time, they're going to know my voting record, see my voting record, and all of a sudden I'm going to be getting money from these political action committees for my re-election campaign. All right, so again, PAC funding provides a very significant advantage for the incumbents, and again, thereby helps to ensure that incumbents get re-elected. Now, it's probably a useful idea to talk about the organization of both the House and the Senate as well. So we're going to talk briefly about how the Congress is organized, and we're going to start first with the Senate. The Senate, basically, the top person in the Senate is, believe it or not, the Vice President of the United States. The Vice President is the presiding officer of the Senate. Now, the Vice President does not have really any power in the Senate. The Vice President really has no voting power unless, or cannot vote unless there's an even split, a 50-50 split between, let's say, between the Republicans and the Democrats, and they were 50-50. And in a situation like that, and it doesn't have to be a 50-50 split like that, but let's say even on a given vote there's a 50-50 split, the vice president in those cases can cast the deciding vote, and will obviously cast the deciding vote in favor of either the president's prerogative and certainly the party's prerogative. So if there's a 50-50 vote, there's an even split in the Senate, then the vice president only then can cast a deciding vote for the legislation. So other than that, the vice president really doesn't have any power in terms of the Senate. And oftentimes, you will see instead of the vice president presiding over the Senate, there's a person right behind the second person in command, if you will, and this is the president pro tempore, or temporary, I should say, temporary. I want to say tempore because it's T-E-M-P-O-R-E, but it's really pronounced temporary, the president pro tempore. And now, the president pro tempore is chosen by the majority party, and the purpose of the president pro tempore is to preside over the Senate in the absence of the vice president. This is often an honorific position, and it's usually given to the most senior senator of that party. All right, but again, often it's done by a junior member because no one really wants a job. Again, it's not a whole lot of power. So the real leadership really begins, and it's in the hands of the Senate Majority Leader and the Senate Minority Leader. All right, the Majority Leader and the Minority Leader. The Majority Leader is the member of the Senate of the majority party, whichever party is in control. The Minority Leader, of course, is the minority party at the time. If the party, every 2 years, again, the House of Representatives goes up for a full re-election, a third of the Senate, because they serve a 6-year term, so approximately a third of the Senate will go up for re-election. Every 2 years, let's say you may have a change in control of the party in the Senate, and if you have a change, then the minority leader during one session, in the following session, may become the majority leader. The majority leader is responsible for scheduling the business of the Senate, basically crafting the legislative agenda, working with other leaders in the Senate to help craft what's going to be our legislative agenda during this 2-year congressional session. What are we going to focus on? Is it going to be health care? Is it going to be reforming Social Security? Is it going to be focusing on foreign policy and the foreign policy dangers that we have? The majority leader will be playing a key role with other senior leaders and members of the Senate of that party, of the majority party, in terms of crafting a legislative agenda. And if the president is of the same party, working with the president in terms of helping to craft this legislative agenda. Now, besides the majority and minority leaders, there are also what you would call deputies, and the deputies are called the majority and minority whips. To make it even further confusing, you've also got deputy whips that are deputies to these whips. But basically, the purpose of the majority and minority whips, think about the bullwhip kind of thing, and rounding up cattle or something like that. Well, the purpose of the majority whip, for example, is to help round up the party members, or the minority whip helps to round up the party members too, when important votes are about to take place. So they try to keep a head count on how the voting on a controversial issue is likely to go. So for example, if you are the majority whip and I'm the majority leader, I may call upon you and say, okay, how many members of our party, how many senators are going to be voting for this piece of legislation? How many votes do we have secured for this controversial piece of legislation? And your job is to keep me informed on that, but your job is also to make phone calls to other members of the Senate, both in our party and members of the other party, and try to press upon them the need to vote for this piece of legislation. So you're trying to round up votes, you're trying to press, you're working the phones, if you will, trying to persuade other members, particularly of your party, but also maybe other members of the other party too, to vote on this legislation. So that's the idea behind the majority and minority whips, keeping a head count on how voting is going and trying to make sure that you're keeping your party members in line. Make sure there's party discipline, if you will, that members of the party will vote in accordance with the party leadership. Now, in terms of the House, let's talk about the organization of the House. The top person in the House is the Speaker of the House. And the Speaker is elected by whichever party is the majority party. So for example, and let's go back to 2006, that was a milestone because we elected, the Democratic Party was the controlling party in the House of Representatives, and the Democratic Party elected for the first time female Speaker of the House, and that was Nancy Pelosi. The Speaker of the House is the presiding officer of the House, the leader of the majority party, and the second in line to succeed the president behind the vice president. He or she has a lot of powers. He or she has the ability to decide who can be recognized to speak on the floor given a debate on a particular bill. He or she decides the committees to which new bills will be assigned, and that's a very important power. In a lot of ways, I think about a traffic cop and directing the flow of traffic. The Speaker can be in a particularly powerful position by making a determination as to which bills will get assigned to which committees. And the reason why it's important, and there are still other rules that kind of govern the bills, the committees to which will oversee which bills, but nonetheless, that extra power on the part of the Speaker basically means that if a Speaker doesn't like a particular bill that's maybe a person of the minority party, sponsors a bill, well, the Speaker can almost guarantee its death of that bill by simply assigning it to a committee that has a committee chair, which will be a colleague of his or hers in the same party, that doesn't like this legislation. So in a lot of ways, they single-handedly can make sure that bills will never see the light of day and get reported out of committee. We'll be talking about committee system in just a second here. But again, that's the power of the Speaker to basically that they can assign bills to committees. The Speaker also has the ability to influence what bills are brought up for a vote, and then he or she also has the ability to appoint members of Congress for special committees that are created. All right, so you have the Speaker, very, very powerful person in the House of Representatives. Below them, you also have majority leaders and minority leaders. All right, and often the majority leader or minority leader will in time become the Speaker. I used Nancy Pelosi as an example because at one time Nancy Pelosi was minority leader. But often the majority leaders and minority leaders can ultimately become this, down the road the Speaker of the House once that party becomes in control of the House. And again, as part of their role, the majority and minority leaders are part of the top leadership of the House. They help to craft the party's legislative agenda. Like the Senate majority and minority leaders. And then also you have, again, your majority and minority whips that are helping to round up votes and work with the part of the key party leadership here to help round up votes, to help get on the phone, to help persuade members of the House to vote a particular way on some legislation that the party wants to see occur. Now, the last thing I'll talk about during this section here is the role of committees. And committees are probably one of the most important bodies in both the House and the Senate. This is where the real work gets done. People who chair committees and subcommittees are among some of the most powerful members of Congress. Now there are 4 types of committees. We're going to talk about each of them, and I'll come back and elaborate upon some of them too. The most important committee is a standing committee. These are permanent bodies. These are the ones that craft the vast majority of legislation or consider legislation. Some examples of these standing committees would be, for example, the Senate Armed Services Committee, the House Armed Services Committee, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the Senate Judiciary Committee, the House Appropriations Committee. Okay, these are some of the standing committees. In the Senate, there are 16 standing committees, and you can refer to your book to see which ones they are, all of them. And there are 19 standing committees in the House of Representatives. And in each House, the House and the Senate, there are well over 50 subcommittees, because there are several subcommittees that are associated with each of the standing committees. Now, besides the standing committees, there are also select committees. Select committees are temporary committees, often for a limited time and a limited purpose. There might be, for example, a select committee on Social Security reform. They're going to look at, maybe create legislation to reform the Social Security system. They generally last no more than 2 years, generally during a session of Congress, and are disbanded at the end of the congressional session. Okay? So these select committees are temporary committees for special, like a research purposes or for very, very limited temporary kind of specialized purpose. You also have another type of committee called a joint committee. These again are more permanent bodies. This is a case where members on both houses serve. So on a joint committee, you'll have often equally the same number of members of the House of Representatives and the same number of members of the Senate. For example, a famous joint committee is a Joint Economic Committee. And the Joint Economic Committee is actually responsible for helping to work with both houses of Congress in helping to look at economic projections and looking at the economic implications of various legislations that's proposed, and also the various budgets that are proposed as well. What are the implications of the entire budget, and what are the projections of the budget in the next fiscal year? So the Joint Economic Committee deals a lot with these kinds of issues. Again, they tend to have both members from both houses serve. They tend to be long-term in nature. Okay, so you can have the Joint Economic Committee, the Joint Committee on Taxation, are examples of two important joint committees. And then the fourth type of committee that you find in Congress is something called the Conference Committee. Like the select committees, these are temporary committees, short-term in nature. And also, like the joint committees, members of both houses serve. Now, the specific purpose for the conference committees are to resolve differences between a House version of a bill and a Senate version of a bill. When a bill passes through Congress, it has to go through both houses. And not surprisingly, when a bill comes out of one house, it may have certain provisions, and when a bill comes through and meanders its way through another house, it may end up looking quite different from the first house outcome. So you may have a House version of a bill and a Senate version of the bill. And sometimes those differences can be very, very significant. Well, when you have that, then basically a conference committee will be formed. Members of both houses will serve on this. The key actors who played a role in crafting the legislation from both the House and the Senate will be serving on the conference committee. They will try to resolve and hammer out differences between the Senate version and the House version. And then once they've done that, then that conference committee is disbanded. So it's temporary in nature. And it has that special and only purpose is to resolve differences between the House and Senate versions of that bill. Now the committees, and let's go back and talk about the standing committees by and large, because this is what we're talking about here in particular in terms of size. The committees can vary in size from 5 or 6 to well over 50. Generally, if you're a member of Congress, you serve on more than one committee, but you can be chair of only one. Now, if you're thinking about getting elected to Congress, either the Senate or the House, you're going to want to serve on important committees. For example, the Senate Judiciary Committee plays a major role in terms of determining who are going to be the future members of the Supreme Court. They're the ones who actually vote and give approval or not give approval on presidential nominees to the Supreme Court. That's a very, very important committee. So you're thinking about what committees are you going to be serving on. If you happen to come from an area that has a lot of agriculture, you're naturally going to want to serve on the House Agricultural Committee or on the Senate Agricultural Committee. And so you're going to try to, obviously you're going to be thinking about these kinds of areas of committees. And what's also interesting too is that you tend to stay on the same committee over time, over the number of years. So if you're re-elected and you're an incumbent and you're re-elected over and over again, over time staying on these same committees, you're going to rise over time to maybe to the position of chair of these committees. And at the same time, you're going to develop a lot of expertise in that area. You might, for example, find defense policy to be a very, very interesting and important area. You may have military bases in your district. And over time, you may be the chair of the House Armed Services Committee or the Senate Armed Services Committee. And as part of that, you're going to know a lot about defense. You're going to become an expert on defense issues. In fact, one of the persons that I work for, Sam Nunn from Georgia, was at one time the chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and he was noted as well recognized as an expert on defense policy, and in part because of the number of years he had served on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Now, the party with the majority party will have the majority of seats on each of these committees, and in fact, what you'll see is that on all the committees and all the subcommittees, they will try to reflect a relative, who sits on these committees will reflect the majority and the minority proportion in the House or Senate as a whole. In other words, if the House has a 55 to 45 majority of Democrats in the let's say in the Senate, then in the Senate, then the Senate committees will tend to reflect that 55-45 split in terms of the makeup of all the committees. The same idea applies to the House. The relative strength of the parties that control each of the houses will control the chairs of those committees, and they will tend to have a relative majority of those members on those committees from that party, okay? So you tend to see the same ratio of seats on committees as they are and make up in the House or Senate as a whole. And again, the standing committees are the most important. By and large, they are the ones that can propose legislation by reporting a bill to the full House or Senate. And the chair of each committee is quite powerful. It used to be based solely on seniority. It's not as much now. Some of the rules have changed, but at one point in time, is the senior members of a person in a committee became of the majority party, and the senior member was the chair of that committee. Today, committee chairs are selected by secret ballot, and junior members now have a little bit more independence. They're not necessarily having to follow the party line as senior members necessarily, and so the committee chairs don't have quite the same degree of power as they used to have many years ago. Also, I'll say this about committees. Committees have what I call a lot of jurisdictional overlap in terms of policies, and that can actually lead to a lot of fragmentation. Sometimes the left hand may not know what the right hand is doing, or a particular bill that relates to a particular area could be considered by several different committees, and it may be considered by one committee but not by another. And so even though it's a bill dealing with, say, transportation policy or something, one committee is looking at it, doesn't know what the other committee is doing with regard to it. And I'll just give you a specific example. Let me give you environmental policy. There could be a bill on the environment that's talking about cleaning up the environment. And this bill could be considered by, for example, in the Senate, by the Senate's Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, or by the Senate's Energy and Natural Resources Committee. Also, it could be considered by the Senate's Environment and Public Works Committee. So here are three different committees that relate to environmental policy. And so you can see how there might be a lot of overlap among the different committees. Now, this is probably a good point to stop. Since we've been talking about the committees and the leadership and about the House and the Senate, what we're going to be doing the next session is talk about the process by which a bill becomes a law. And then once we talk about that, we'll also be talking about how members of Congress vote and what are the kinds of things that influence members of Congress. Okay. Following that, we'll be talking about the role of staffs and some other issues such as term limits, what are good things about term limits, and maybe why term limits may not be such a good idea. Okay? So for now, this is probably a good stopping point for Congress. We'll pick this discussion of Congress up in our next session. So this is Patrick Scott. We'll see you next time.